There is an area so unfathomably large, humans refer to it simply as space.
The Interplanetary Podcast. The exploration of space for the benefit of all mankind. Your hosts here in London, Matthew Russell and Jamie Franklin.
So Jamie, I have no idea where that quote's from. Don't ask me.
No, I won't, Matt. But more importantly, Matt.
Yeah?
How was your trip?
My trip was absolutely amazing. I've been recovering ever since because I was very tired on the way back because I did not sleep at all for one whole night.
So, Matt, for new listeners, can you just give us a brief summary of where you've been and why?
Okay, so yeah, I went to French Guiana, which is the European spaceport, essentially, or it's known as the CSG to those people that are in the know. That's Le Centre Spatial Guyanais, or the Guyana Space Centre.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so yeah, I've been out in the jungle. In the Caribbean.
Did you see any exotic animals?
There were quite a few exotic birds. Apparently there's normally capybaras and things like that. I saw some brilliant spiders. Yeah. We went for a walk in the jungle so that we could see the spaceport from a hill. And in this viewing point there was loads of massive spiders. So that was quite cool.
Ooh.
Yeah, that was good.
Wow.
But yeah, I've had an absolutely amazing time hanging out with none other than Eric Berger, which was amazing. I mean, imagine that. Two people, one of the greatest space journalists of all time, and Eric Berger standing there with a drink.
Hey.
Right, so...
Matt, how long did it take you to write that?
Oh, no, I was thinking about it last night. I was thinking I'll get Jamie with that one.
I'll drop that clanger. Brilliant.
It's a total have I got news for you joke, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, Matt, you're completely on the ball. You're not jet lagged anymore. This is good times.
No, absolutely. Do you know what? So when we landed, one of the you know that it's cool because there was an enormous Antonov 124 aircraft, and that's how most of the satellites arrive. So it's one of those aircraft that you can fit an aircraft in. So if you have to transport the fuselage of a 747, you stick it in one of those things.
Awesome.
The kind of airport itself is very space themed, so there's loads of model rockets and everything there. Yeah, lots of amazing birds flying around. It was incredible. It was absolutely genius.
Wow. Well, Matt, I'm glad you had a good time. We're going to go into this more later, aren't we?
Yeah, totally. Big time. Remember the space word of the week?
Yeah.
I haven't got one this week. Yeah, but remember what aphelion meant?
Isn't it our planet is the furthest distance away from the sun during its elliptical orbit, even though us in the northern hemisphere are experiencing hot summer weather?
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that incredible? So I'm literally sitting here sweating because it's so hot in London, but we are actually the furthest away from the sun that we will be all year. Incredible. So we're at aphelion, the furthest away point from the sun.
You know what, Matt? If Alanis Morissette was here, she'd say it was ironic.
But she would be wrong. It's not irony. It's science.
No,
it's science, Alanis.
Science. Well, no, I'm sitting here in a Belgium hotel room because last night I was working with the mighty Queens of the Stone Age at Rock Virtue Festival.
Oh, nice.
Which I have to say, Matt, is very good.
Have Queens of the Stone Age ever done a space-based song?
Well, Matt, do you know what? They played last night, My God is the Sun.
Oh, there we go.
So, done. Tick.
I wonder if they even realised that they were the furthest distance away from it than they'd ever been.
Well, Matt, as I was watching them play last night, I was looking up in the sky and I could see Jupiter just shining brightly over the stage. And I thought, yeah, this is a good day.
That is cool.
What a planet, eh? What a planet.
What a planet. Let's go round the planet and do a bit of space news. So I noticed in China, the chief designer of the Chinese Academy of Launch Vehicles, which I know you know is CALT.
Yeah.
Is a guy called Long Li Hao. Now, isn't it crazy that his first name is the same as that of a rocket?
Yeah.
So he's been talking about the Long March 8 and 9 rockets that they're building. So these are actually really cool. So we've talked about the Long March 8 briefly before. and that's going to start flying in 2021 apparently, and it's going to have the first stage and the boosters will attempt vertical landings, just like the Falcon. So that's going to be
excellent news. Well, it was always going to go that way.
Yeah, well, and the Long March 9, which they think will take off in about 2030, that is your kind of Saturn V SLS BFR-sized rocket, 140 tons to low Earth orbit. So yeah, that's going to be huge, 10-meter diameter compared to the 3.35 diameter of the Long March 7. So yeah, that's massive, and it's using some engines that they've been working on, the Hydrolox and kerosene engines. That'll be used for things like sample return missions to the moon, possibly to carry people up into low Earth orbit and do lots of in sort of human missions. So yeah, it'll be pretty cool.
I might apply to that one, Matt, just like I did Virgin Galactic. I wonder if they'll reply to me.
Probably not.
Dear Mr. Longley Howe, my name's Jamie from the Interplanetary podcast. Would you like me to work for you on your rockets? Yes, no. And I could put those boxes that you tick.
Well, it's something that people don't really know about, is that the European astronauts, some of the European astronauts, have been actually training to go up with the Chinese to the Chinese space station. We reported that a few weeks ago about how the Chinese are opening up their space station.
Oh, yeah.
And so, some of the European astronauts have been training to do that. And of course, the American astronauts miss out on it because the Americans refuse to work with the Chinese.
Which is a shame, Matt, because as we know, in space, there shouldn't be the same politics, should there?
Well, one of the best things about the European Space Centre was just how many countries are involved and how well they all get on together and how this place works perfectly. Like 1,700 employees, and they're all from different European nations, all just getting on and making things happen. It's incredible. But anyway, we'll hear about that on another show, because I've got some interviews from that visit as well. So,
sweet. Well, Matt, here's a question for you. What's going on in India?
Ooh, so we're moving slightly around the world here. India, they've been testing I'm talking about Crew, they've been testing their launch escape system, the pad abort test. So yeah, they're sort of inching towards joining China, Russia, and America in being the only people capable of getting people into space.
So this is the safe recovery of Crew modules.
Yeah, and it looks like it was really successful. 259 seconds, and it flew 2.7 kilometres under the power of the escape motors. 300 sensors, making sure that the module didn't go and exceed the sort of safe G levels, because there's no point flinging your crew out of the way of your blowing up rocket if it means that they all die from the G forces from the abort.
That would be counterproductive.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what's been happening in Indian space, which I think that's a pretty big one, isn't it? That one.
Well, Matt, talking a big one, we're only playing Sweden in the quarter-final of the World Cup. Matt, don't adjust your set. I said quarter-final of the World Cup.
Yep.
This Saturday.
Oh my God! I only barely lived through those penalties. I
honestly think I aged about 20 years.
I know. Well, I saw a picture of you the other day, and you looked, in episodes of Star Trek where...
Don't say I looked 60.
In episodes of Star Trek where they all age really quickly and things like that, and they've got that makeup on. Yeah. It was like that. That's what you look like.
Oh, thanks.
But no, it's like in Star Trek, they all went back down to their young age again.
Phew.
Yeah. So you're all right.
Thank
you're
goodness.
All right. You're all right.
Well, Matt, the reason I brought the football up is because it's going to be played, that game, in a formerly closed city of Samara.
I know. That's actually really exciting. So for any football fans listening, I don't know. Maybe football fans and space fans.
Yeah.
There is some crossing over on the Venn diagram.
There must be.
There must be. Well, there's us two.
Well, there's two. Yeah.
But yeah. So it used to be known as Kuibyshev, the city of Samara, after the Bolshevik leader Valerian Kuibychev. So, yeah, and it's, of course, where Vostok was made, which is where basically the first manned spaceship by with Yuri Gagarin in it. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? And Yuri Gagarin actually stayed in Samara when he had finished his first orbital flight. And the Progress Rocket Space Center is there as well. So all the things like the Soyuz rocket, the Buran Space Shuttle. There's even a monument to the Buran Space Shuttle next to the Airspace University. But
there is. I'm staring at it right now. It's it's interesting.
Yeah, well, and the craziest one is the 68-meter full-size Soyuz monument that's kind of hanging off the side of the building. So that's absolutely enormous, 68-meter monument. So
it's big.
Yeah. It was very much a kind of military base, which is why it became a sort of closed city.
So there we go. A little bit of trivia for you when we beat Sweden on Saturday.
So definitely look out for all the rocket stuff when any football fans who are going out there. Russia have actually been quite busy as well. So the new boss, the Rogozin, he's clearly stamping his mark as well. We've got Vladimir Suntsev, the head of RSC Energia, is stepping down from his post with no reason. And the rocket maker RCC Progress have a new leader. Dmitry Alexandrovich Baranov.
Welcome.
Who's been acting as general director and replaces R.N. Arkametov. So, so it seems like there's a lot of shake-up going in the Russian space industry.
It does. Well, sometimes it's good to have a shake-up.
Yeah. One last piece of UK news. We've managed to come
I'm excited about
the way west over to the UK. So, yeah, I noticed that Doug Messier was reporting on Parabolic Arc that Cornwall Council are anticipating a positive announcement on their bid to become UK's first spaceport in Newquay.
So rad.
Yeah, and that's going to be announced at the Farnborough Air Show on July the 16th. Are you going to the Farnborough Air Show, Jamie?
Yeah, I think we're going.
Yeah, we're going. So you're coming to that. So you're coming to the Farnborough Air Show.
Yeah.
As might Julio as well.
Oh, yes.
It looks like Newquay have taken over, but this is a warning that comes from Doug Messier's website, and I love this. He says, don't get too excited about having a spaceport, and then he goes on to list what's going on. So he goes, in the Mojave spaceport hasn't seen a space flight in 14 years. Apart from small rocket launches, Spaceport America has stayed largely idle. And you don't need $225 million to build a sounding rocket launch site. The Midland Spaceport expired when X-Corps and Orbital Outfitters did. Burn Flat in Oklahoma never saw a launch, and Florida's Cecil Airport is still waiting for its first space flight. So there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, for the downer.
It's not a good scene, is it?
There's us thinking that we're going to go surfing and watching horizontal space launches, and there's old Doug giving it the thumbs down.
Absolutely.
But fair play to him, he's got a point.
Jamie, I'm going to talk to you only a little bit about my trip to French Guiana. Just very, very briefly. The reason why I was there, of course, was to see the new Ariane 6 and Vega C kind of infrastructure. And part of that was going to be the test of the P120C, which is a massive solid rocket booster. In fact, it's the largest monolithic booster ever made. And by monolithic, it means that it's in one piece. So when you look at something like the Ariane 5, the boosters on the Ariane 5 are actually three boosters stacked on top of one another. So they're built in three parts, basically, S1, S2, and S3. Yes. Which actually is it's amazingly how complicated that is. And to actually sort of attach them to one another, the accuracy is is just totally ridiculous. It's something like 0.01 millimeters or something ridiculous. It's
insane.
So it's got to be absolutely perfect. So the monolithic one doesn't need to it's just one part. And the clever thing about the P120C solid rocket booster is that it's the C actually in Vega C and P120C I think stands for common. So it means that the Vega C first stage is this solid rocket booster, but Ariane 6 boosters that are attached to it, so there's either 2 or 4 on the Ariane 6, are this P120C as well. So that way they can really just make loads of these things and use them for different purposes. So there's a massive cost saving there. So that I think right. So that's the really clever part of it. Vega C gets a huge kind of payload lift, so that it can carry more stuff into space. And Ariane 6 is half the price of Ariane 5, and you can double the amount of Ariane 6s you can launch in 1 year. So it's a significant upgrade, and they're quite a long way to finishing. I went round the Vega mobile launch gantry. That has got these extra red circles in the gantries that come down so that you can get to the rocket. They've been extended to house the slightly larger Vega C. So they've already kind of allowed for the Vega C, and the Ariane 6, the mobile gantry that's being built for that's almost. You can see that's almost finished, and they've almost finished the launch pad. So it's pretty incredible. But get this. So the mobile gantry for Ariane 6 is it moves around. So it's one of those enormous buildings that's on rails, essentially. And it's the same weight as the Eiffel Tower, yet it moves around.
Say what?
Yet it moves around on rails. That's pretty cool, isn't it?
Damn.
Yeah, it's mad.
That's heavy.
Yeah, it's bang out heavy. So it was
Matt, I hope you had a hard hat on. I mean, if that fell on you, I'd be devastated.
Oh, I did have a hard hat on. We all had hard hats on.
Good.
Yeah, so it was. As you'll see in the pictures, I've been posting pictures up, of course, on our Instagram. But yeah, we'll do a proper report on this because. We're running out of time here, Jamie. Because I'm now going to play you.
We are
the much anticipated part 2.
Part 2
of Alan Bond interview. I didn't want to play it this soon. I was going to do the interview we did with the Mars 500 chap, but everyone has been kind of hassling me for part 2, so I thought no.
Well, and I've been hassling you, Matt, but you said no, you're going to wait like the listeners, so I'm excited. Let's go.
Absolutely.
Please.
So here is the second, probably even more interesting, part 2 of the Alan Bond interview.
Roll that ish.
So in 1989, the three of us, Richard Varville, John Scott and myself, formed Reaction Engines. And Rolls-Royce decided that they didn't want the patents on the loose for the RB54 engine. And I'd already entered an agreement with them that they could take the patents on. And they closed on that agreement and essentially took the patents, locked them away with absolutely no intention of doing anything with them. And so Reaction Engines would have been faced as a company with no product. However, I've already hinted that the thermodynamics of these engines is incredibly subtle. And although when I wrote the patents for the Hotel engine, it was intended that nobody should be able to infringe them, I then had the interesting task of trying to infringe my own patents. And surprise, surprise, other thermodynamic issues came to light, and I found that was possible. And so the Sabre engines were born, which, whilst if you draw yourself a temperature entropy diagram of these engines, the engines look very similar. The actual engineering, which is what patents are all about, is very, very different. And the Sabre engine was very different from the RB545 engine. First off, most importantly, is that the pre-cooler, which cools the incoming air into an RB545 engine, uses the hydrogen as the coolant. And that has both thermodynamic and material implications. And to some people, although not to me, perceived safety issues in the event of a catastrophic pre-cooler failure that would dump hot hydrogen straight into the intake of the engine. and some people saw that as a risk. I must admit that particular aspect never actually bothered me. However, in the Sabre engines, helium is used, and that's got both thermodynamic implications and material implications. So high temperature materials tend to be embrittled by hydrogen. And helium, of course, is completely benign, so we can use some of the best nickel alloys that are readily available to make the pre-cooler out of. And so that immediately was a step forward. But the use of helium within the cycle also enables some subtleties in the thermodynamics. It's not easy to go into them just describing it, but enables the efficiencies to start to approach the thermodynamic ideal efficiencies, whereas with liquid hydrogen, which is already at sort of 20 Kelvin, when you get it out of the propellant tanks, you've got limitations, thermodynamic limitations forced upon you by that, together with the I've already mentioned varying specific heat problems of hydrogen, which don't exist with helium, or at least to nowhere near the same extent. So the Sabre engines were born, and beginning of the 1990s, Rolls-Royce, having acquired my patent, which they paid me handsomely for, all that money then got sunk back into reaction engines to actually fund the activity of trying to get the Sabre engine and also the Skylon vehicle. So just coming back to HOTL for a minute, I explained that HOTL developed this horrendous pitch-up moment at Mach 5. And we had an opportunity as reaction engines, the three of us, to have a look at why that had occurred. And it had occurred because if you ever look at a picture of HOTL, you'll see the engines are stuck right on the rear of the fuselage. And the reason for that is all the people that did it had come from a rocket background. And of course, where are the engines on a rocket? Well, they're on the back. If you have a look at any typical aeroplane, they're not. They're on wings or whatever. And you can move the centre of gravity of the aircraft around by positioning the wing and where you hang the engines on it. So we made that move with Skylon, and if you look at Skylon, you'll see that the biggest configuration change comes from putting the engines out on the wingtips. Now, it's unfortunate it makes it look a bit like some of the 1920s and 30s Herman Oberth sort of concepts. But the reality is that gives absolute control then over the pitch-up moment. And so in one fell swoop, we solve the pitch-up problem on HOTL. And then due to another range of innovations like changing how the structure was done and so on, we finished up in Skylon with something that was very, very credible as a single stage to orbit vehicle. And whereas HOTL, we'd always been struggling to get payload, one of the reasons being because of the pitch-up moment, we had to have massive flaperons with a massive hydraulic system to drive it. And in the end, HOTL was carrying 4.5 tons of hydraulics into orbit. It had become a transportation system for hydraulics into low Earth orbit. As soon as we solved the pitch-up problem, that was immediately 4 tons to our favour. The other thing with HOTL is that with HOTL, you've got to remember it was all new to us, and so we didn't know how to optimise the engines, the air intake, the shape of the vehicle, and the trajectory profile in order to maximise the payload to orbit. We set about in the early 1990s to resolve those issues, and what came out of it, amazingly, is that the engine is not demanding a high performance intake. Now that's unknown to jet engines. Jet engines always want the best intake they can get, whereas the Sabre engine wants the intake that optimises its performance on the trajectory as it's climbing to orbit. And one of the problems which one of the Germans, when we were sort of scouting for people to join us, alluded to, was that we don't know how to make an intake that bad. And we thought that was just a joke, but it did come home to bite us. It is, in fact, quite difficult to make an intake down at the efficiencies that the engine's asking for and keep it stable. because obviously an inefficient intake has got loss mechanisms inside it, and if you get that wrong, those loss mechanisms drive instabilities. So, so that came home to bite us. But eventually, we did solve all of those issues, and reaction engines today has basically got functioning designs for the Sabre engine and for the Skylon vehicle. But again, politics is driving the current reaction engines in a direction that means that they will be looking for terrestrial applications of the technology before they're looking for the spaceplane applications. So it's going to be dragged out before this technology actually finds its way into a fully serviceable operating spaceplane. Somewhere beyond the 2030s, maybe. But I'm quite convinced that nothing has ever changed my view right from the 1960s that there is a desperate need for such a vehicle, and that need will get more and more acute as time goes on. So where we stand today is that all of those technologies are excellent. Reaction engines is getting ready for a major demonstration of an engine around about 2020. They're building a large test facility, the largest test facility that's been built in this country for many decades at Westcott, on the old Westcott site, which is a nice little bit of historical closure. And with luck, they'll demonstrate the technology, and then maybe somebody will decide that it would be a good idea if they put it into practice. Yeah. Because I do sincerely believe that will completely change the complexion of space transportation. Now, like the Americans with the early shuttle concept, this is only the getting into orbit bit. So come back, Mr. Von Perke, because we need a space infrastructure to go with it. And the only thing that we ever really looked at was very, very briefly what we called a logistical space infrastructure. And that consists of vehicles operating in resonant orbits so that they can transfer and deploy propellant strategically and use them to fill the whole of cislunar space with completely reusable vehicles, which can find propellants in orbit and then go on to complete other aspects of the mission. And it turns out that if you do get a Skylon fleet, 60% of its traffic to orbit is propellants for the upper stages and the space operating elements. So one can see a whole network of space, what I prefer to think of transport nodes, but is good old-fashioned space stations in science fiction parlance. And at the transport nodes, payloads are moved from vehicle to vehicle, and the vehicles are refueled and complete the space infrastructure part of it. And indeed, that is such a powerful concept that the ultimate expression of that we studied at Reaction Engines back in 2006 was the Troy project, which was a mission to Mars, but done essentially logistically, in which a precursor mission reaches Mars first, automatically sets up bases on the surface and emergency return facilities and so on in orbit. And then 2 years later, at the next suitable configuration, the manned mission goes. But we looked at it with a Columbus mission with 3 ships and 6 people in each vehicle. So that was the last of the interplanetary missions that I was actively involved in. And that all looks as though Skylon would enable that and bring the costs, well down. Even so, even with the most optimistic costs I could put into Skylon, you're still talking at more at today's numbers, in 2006 numbers, about $70 to $100 billion for a first manned exploratory mission to Mars, but it would be with 18 people. So, and that's not far short. If you total up all the missions that have been flown to Mars at the present time, with the very limited understanding that we have of Mars, that is approximately a sum of similar order that's already been spent to have a few rovers sort of pottering around on the surface and returning data which is ambiguous, to say the least, in a lot of instances. I've always maintained that an astronaut with a spade would learn more in the first day on Mars than all of the stuff that we've sent there so far.
Yeah.
One of the things that happened in all this time is I got old. And so last year, around about my 73rd birthday, I decided that it was time for me to retire. Reaction Engine had grown to 160 people from the three of us who founded it. We brought in a chief engineer from Rolls-Royce to take over the chief executive role in the company. And he has turned Reaction Engines from a funny little research outfit into a company that looks more like a mainstream aerospace company. And of course that was essential if Reaction Engines is going to be accepted by the major aerospace companies. So Mark Thomas has done a good job of sort of reshaping the company. It's been very painful for quite a lot of the original inhabitants of the company to make that transition, but I think that it's now settling down, and Reaction Engines, I think, has got a bright and assured future from that point of view. So what about my own interests as of that point in time? I'm still regarded as having something useful to say at Reaction Engines, so I go in there about 30 days a year, and I'm coming up to between the end of the first year that I've been in this novel situation of being retired. But I've left out some interesting issues which is perhaps appropriate for me to cover now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, far away.
So going back to 1978 and my work with Tony Martin at the Atomic Energy Authority, as I've explained, I took over the engineering of the so-called Magnets and Structures group of the Engineering Design Division. And I realised that if you've got a simple circular magnet and you put a couple of electrodes across a diameter, and then if you could ionise the air around it, which is very difficult to do at sea level, but nonetheless, let's assume that you could do it, then you'd have a very different kind of vehicle, because by passing a current across the magnetic field, it ejects the air in one direction and pushes the vehicle in the other. And so this is a vehicle essentially which is a fully electric aeroplane with no moving parts other than what is providing the electrical power. Come back to that in a moment. So Tony Martin and myself thought, well, that looks interesting, wonder if it works. So I think it was B&Q we went round to and bought a large loft tank and stopped at Tesco's on the way to get some salt. And we filled the tank with 50 gallons of salt water. I wound up a field coil with the help of my wife. I was married in those days. And Tony borrowed a power supply. We juiced it up at the Culham lab and watched it take off across the tank in a very satisfying manner. And the Star Wars film was out and around at those days, and it looked for all the world like the Millennium Falcon as it shot across the tank, leaving a trail of green bubbles from one electrode and white bubbles from the other.
Oh, wow.
But over the subsequent sort of 4 years, up to 1982, when HOTL took over my life, the problem that we never managed to solve at that stage was to ionise the air effectively. Had lots of ideas of how to do it, but we only carried out a few actual experiments, but they weren't very successful. Anyway, when it came up to a concept of retirement last year, I sort of thought, what am I going to do? Well, this was always a very exciting possibility of building. I mean, it looks for all the world like a flying saucer. It's a circular coil. It's circular because of the very high stresses in it, because you need a relatively powerful magnetic field to limit the amount of electric current you have to pass, and therefore the conductivity to produce a thrust. So I unearthed this and went back to looking at the issues of ionisation. Now, I think I've made some progress with that. And so in December, back end of 2017, I started a new company called Meraquark Limited for fairly complex reasons. And I've been working on that ever since. And I'm now in the process of trying to snare some unsuspecting people into it
Right.
in order to start to get some experimental work carried out. And at the moment, that's right in the stages of dialogue, so I don't feel that I can disclose much about that. The Meraquark end of it, which is simply me and my company, I don't mind talking about that, but I can't talk about the third parties at this point in time. But alongside of that, a new type of plasma engine, because this engine works in the atmosphere. The trajectory modelling suggests that it can accelerate up to 8 kilometres per second at an altitude of about 45 kilometres. That puts it into an orbit with an apogee of 500 kilometres. And then because of my background in advanced propulsion, I've tinkered together an idea for a plasma engine that takes over at that point. It's like the Vasimir. It looks nothing like a Vasimir engine, but it does have variable specific impulse. And given a fusion power supply, it looks as though this vehicle could certainly hack interplanetary flight very easily and very rapidly, but also is a candidate now, I think, for interstellar flight. So, which is a lot simpler than the original Project Daedalus vehicle.
Right.
So that's where it currently stands. With regard to the fusion power supply for it, I did a lot of work in magnetic confined fusion, and I've also done a lot of work on fission reactors, and neither of those would have the power to weight ratio to drive this thing. But there is a sort of little outside runner known as an inertial electrostatic confinement configuration, and a guy named Miley has been pushing these for a long time in the States, and I think that there is a fighting chance that those could ultimately deliver the power to weight ratio that you're looking for. Unlike magnetic fusion, they've also got the prospect, I'm not saying it will be realised, but at least it's a prospect that they could burn fusion fuels which have very low reaction cross sections. So with magnetic fusion, deuterium and tritium are really where you're at. Deuterium and helium-3 maybe, DD possibly, but you'd never really get to any of the more interesting atoms. But it looks as though a fusel, as they're called, could burn protons and beryllium or protons and lithium, which would be quite good.
Did you have some questions?
Yeah,
Some quick questions?
I suppose one is the design of the Sabre engine originally had this very distinct curve to it.
Yes.
And now it appears that it doesn't have.
It's a bit straighter.
Yeah, it's straightened. Could you talk us through the reason for that change and why it was curved originally?
Yeah, so it's the most common question that gets asked. That curved nacelle has caught everybody's attention. So when you optimise a vehicle like Skylon, the wing is quite important because a large wing gives you relatively low drag because it flies at low incidence and there's small induced drag off the wing. But of course a large wing is heavy, and what matters at the end of the day is what gets into orbit. So it turns out with Skylon that it's got a very small wing and the vehicle flies at about a 6-degree incidence. So you have to turn the engine nacelles down into the coming airstream. So the nacelle turns down about 6 degrees relative to the fuselage. But of course, when you're outside the atmosphere, the thrust vector has got to go through the line of the centre of gravity of the vehicle. And because the wing is a low wing on Skylon, it means you've got to point the thrust vector up by about 6 degrees, give or take. And so the tail of the nacelle has to point down 6 degrees and the nose of the nacelle has to point down 6 degrees. So you finish up with a nacelle with a 12-degree camber. As time has ticked on and we moved to a rather heavier version of Skylon, everything changed rather subtly. Also some changes in the design of the intake, and the current nacelle is much straighter. It's not completely straight. So if you look at the D1 vehicle design, you'll see that it still has a curved nacelle, but it's only about half the camber that the original Skylon C1 had.
I did hear you mention on a video from a while back about how Skylon was going to be. Is it still the plan that Skylon is going to be sold more like a jetliner around the world, so that you would have?
Yeah, so that was always the model that was put together. That a lot of projects died on the design board because of traffic models, and the traffic model was always that governments would fund and operate vehicles. And if you then look at the traffic model, the whole thing sort of runs away into an expensive vehicle and therefore limited traffic. Whereas if you could take the aircraft model, so if we take the Boeing 747, for example, Boeing build an aeroplane and they sell it to all the airplanes, all of the aircraft operators all around the world, and leave it to them to make the profit and operate it profitably. And my view was that should have been the model for Skylon. Now, because of the way that the whole project has evolved, whether that is still a possible model, I don't know. Attempts to pull investment into that model were really not very successful. It's a great shame because the model's completely valid, and I did a huge amount of study over a period of 20 years on that particular model and never found it lacking. But it's like a great many things. I mean, today the world is scared witless with regard to investment and finance and quick returns and so on. It's a legacy from the sort of post-war period, 1980s and so on, and the domination of our culture with the finance industry. And so unless something is absolutely... Why do we keep seeing Batman revisited in the cinemas? Yeah. It's because you can get money to do another Batman film because it's already been proven. Yeah. If you wanted to do Rendezvous with Rama, everybody would be worried about that. Yeah. So we just live in that sort of culture now. I must admit that I'm a bit war-weary of trying to raise funding to do things. I am an engineer, after all. And... So I'm stepping back now and letting a younger, more dynamic team actually address that. But to my mind, that model could still work. But whether you could persuade people to put the money into it, I don't know. It may well be. After all, even the Boeing 747 started out of a requirement for a military program. And it could be argued that Boeing was the winner of that program. Of course, they didn't get the contract, and as a result, they sold their design all around the world. I don't know how many hundreds or even thousands of 747s have now been sold. It's one of those difficulties of the way in which economics works these days. So it may well be that a friendly government or governments somewhere will have to stump up the development cost to have it, but it may then be ultimately saleable.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at something like SLS, the cost of that has just mushroomed, doesn't it? And
it has, but people have got confidence. They know rockets work, whereas at the present time they don't know that Skylons work. Yeah, and so almost certainly there will be a development program that involves flight test vehicles and so on, in order to gradually get the confidence that this is a route forward.
Does that mean that LATCAT will come back as a concept or be developed?
So the LATCAT was very interesting. The LATCAT application is more demanding than the Skylon application. So for an engine in the civil aviation world today, you're looking at lifetimes of 10, 20,000 hours, whereas the lifetime of an engine on Skylon is 50 hours. And so going from that 50 hours up to a pre-cooler that wouldn't need maintenance in, say, 18,000 hours is quite a difficult step to make. But I think that perhaps we were a bit ahead of the game with it all, but it had to start somewhere. And I think that we'll probably see a decade and a half of gradually sort of sneaking up on the goal. When we know that the goal's achievable, I think it will rapidly...
The LAPCAT thing was huge, wasn't it? I mean, it was more or less twice as long as Skylon.
So this is a consequence of the low density of hydrogen. And so although the LAPCAT vehicle was, as you say, 132 metres in length, it only weighed 400 tonnes, which is lower than an Airbus, for example. A lot of aircraft these days are topping the 400-tonne mark, and because it had a sensible wing area, unlike Skylon, it only operated at the same sort of takeoff speeds as Concorde. And in fact, Christopher Orlebar, who sadly is no longer with us, a well-known Concorde pilot, he was a very good friend of reaction engines, and he gave us a lot of advice on the design of the A2 vehicle. We found that we could meet most of those requirements, including extremely good subsonic range, which Concorde never could do, of course. In fact, the subsonic range on the LAPCAT A2 is very close to its Mach 5 range. So it could still get to its destination in the event you had an engine failure and had to drop to subsonic conditions.
Yeah. What do you make of things like these new space barons, the people like Elon Musk and the Jeff Bezoses? What's their part to play in kind of?
So Elon Musk is my hero essentially, because he has had the financial clout which I never had, to sort of take a concept and essentially do it. And quite frankly, there's no reason why the industries couldn't have done this 30 years ago. Elon Musk has been in a position to take them on. I've never been able to make Musk's economics work. I do understand the technology, and I've analysed his vehicles. I would never go for a retro lob personally. I think that's an extremely risky scenario, and I know enough about rocket engines. I'd never risk my life on having to relight one. But nonetheless, it's the route that he's chosen. In engineering, there frequently are no optimum routes. There's a route that you choose, and then through sweat and tears, you make it work. And I think Musk is in that situation with the Falcon 9 Heavy, Falcon 9 and Falcon 9 Heavy. And I think he's got a good combination. I'm less convinced about his big Falcon rocket, if we're being polite. And likewise, I believe that Mars is far too important a scientific object to go trampling around all over it with early colonists who are almost certainly going to die anyway. I don't see what the objective of that is, when we need to understand an awful lot about how the solar system formed. Of course, every time we come up with a neat idea, we always find something that tips it on its head, and the water on Earth doesn't look as though it arrived from comets after all. I personally never thought it did, but it's been a very, very strong theory, which is now sort of turned upside down. We need to examine Mars in a great deal of detail before we go mucking the place up with a lot of human contamination, in order to understand much more about the formation of the solar system. Once we've done all that, fine. But the same is true of the moon to a certain degree. There's also a lot of scientific stuff that we could do of genuine value from the moon. Radio astronomers have long wanted a radio telescope on the opposite side of the moon to shield them from all the radio background noise coming from the Earth. So one can see genuine scientific objectives that could be achieved by having sizable colonies on the moon. But I don't see at this point in time similar objectives in Musk's race to Mars. I think that that's that's much more of an ego trip than a space trip.
What's your feeling on something like the Chinese? Because obviously the Chinese are moving quite steadily towards it.
Every time I make any predictions about what I think the Chinese are going to do, they don't. So I think the Chinese and the Indians have got long-term ambitions. They've got good, steady programs that are leading inexorably in that direction. In many respects, I think they might be the tortoise that overtakes the American hare ultimately. The Americans have obviously been outstanding in the sort of Apollo flags and footprints sort of mission. I think now that it's come down to defining more serious missions in space, that NASA is not really stepping up to the mark very well. And I think one would like to see a bit more solid, deep down thinking from NASA. Right now, you can't help feeling that we've committed to the SLS. What are we going to do with it? And this week's mission option is, and what's it going to be next time? And of course, the other sort of big unknown factor in that at the moment is President Trump. And, I mean, anybody that can predict what he's going to do next is doing very well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last question, I think, actually, is just it was just something that you said. I've seen you say is how Britain really has an opportunity in rocketry in terms of this, getting up into low Earth orbit, because we're not invested in our own rocket industry. Can you elaborate on that point?
So one of the things that I get a little bit tired of hearing of in Britain, we've got politicians and all kinds of civil servants jumping up and down saying, "Oh, we want transformational technology, you want paradigm shift and game changing," and there's lots of other exciting phrases.
Step
change. When you say, "Hang on, here it is," they go, didn't really mean that.
Because, didn't mean actual change.
Yeah, what they realise is that if you bring in, a paradigm shift, there are going to be casualties out of that. Now, you're quite right, and I've held this view for a very long time, that although it didn't seem like it at the time, Clark's sort of assassination of all space transport technology in this country actually left us with a completely clean sheet of paper. You're absolutely right in that, in principle, we could go ahead and do a reusable space transportation with absolutely no casualties at all, and only winners with regard to the propulsion people like Rolls-Royce, the airframers like Airbus and BAE Systems, all of the sort of electronic kit that goes into running such a vehicle, even the establishment of the spaceports, and of course the massive liquid hydrogen supply facilities that would be required. So for half of my lifetime, people have been sort of having rose-tinted visions of a future hydrogen economy. And yet, how is this going to start? Because changing from kerosene is going to be very expensive. Well, Skylon only operates on hydrogen. It has to have hydrogen. It's a project that could shoulder the initial costs of getting into a hydrogen economy, which, like every other sort of large aerospace project, eventually spins that technology out into the wider world. And so I feel that Britain is absolutely the nation that is ideally placed to pull that off. But sadly, I think all of us in recent years have come to recognise that there is no such thing as vision in government. I wouldn't say that about the UK Space Agency. So if I step back in time to the old BNSC, I mean, that was an absolutely blinkered organisation. The current UK Space Agency is not. The current UK Space Agency is labouring against the problems of the lack of visionaries that we have in government, like all the rest of us. I mean, obviously Lord Drayson set it up, and David Willis. Willis really, drove that. But unfortunately, since Willits went, I don't feel that it has a champion anymore, and it's not progressing, in my view, the way that it should. But even if it did, it's still got this uphill task of convincing government that I use the word government as though we had a joined up organisation. We don't, of course. Yeah. The government is a very disconnected entity with different departments having to support different things. But I do feel that if somebody could pull that together and push it forward, then it would happen. You know that there is the roadmap. One of the things that Lord Drayson and David Willis, he's Lord Willis now, of course, brought to the fore is that through the whole of the recession years, space was one area that continued to expand, in some instances in double-digit figures, and it experienced no recession at all. And the idea that we would have 10% of the space industry of the planet by 2030 is a really exciting vision. But unless some of the, I won't use names, but I despair of the people we have on the top shelf, and I don't think that they have any kind of vision at all in a much broader sense than just space.
So,
Matt, I'm kind of speechless. It's just gold nugget after gold nugget with him, isn't it?
Yeah, he genuinely is the absolute legendre.
Love it. Excellent work.
Yeah, that just leaves us with a space fact to do, Jamie.
What we got?
So it's another. I don't know where this one comes from either, but it's kind of true. Every year, everybody on Earth collectively experiences more years than Earth has existed.
Ooh.
You see?
Wow, okay.
Yeah, well, there's 7 billion of us, and we all went through a year, which means there's 7 billion years of collective experience, which is longer than the Earth has been around for.
And the Earth is what, Matt? 4 point...
Something like that.
Something?
Yeah, just under 5 billion or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, pretty cool, eh?
That is pretty cool.
I did promise the big shout-out to our Skylon patrons.
Let's do
it. So we have. And this is just so great to see such a long list of Skylon patrons. These are the big boys. We have Mr. Dr. Bob Hodges.
DBH. Yes, Bob.
Yes, Bob. Jeffrey Marlam.
Go on, Jeff.
John Wilson Benack.
Oh, Big John. Thank you.
Justin Roberts.
Justin, you are a fine man.
Matt Gilliland.
Matt? You're all right.
Oh, thanks.
Stick around.
No, that Matt.
No, not you.
Darren Fuchs.
Darren, I want to be your mate.
He is your mate, Jamie. Richard Swain.
Oh, the Swainster. Come on.
Carell Sim.
Carell, you are now elevated to legend status.
Erin Edwards.
Erin, come at me in a good way.
And the one... and the only Julio Prayer.
Julio, thank you. Everyone, thank you. And Matt, if you want to join that list, how does one go about it?
Interplanetary.org.uk. Just join. Just help us. And I have to say,
just help us out.
I'm gonna absolutely make no bones about this. Without the help of the patrons, I definitely would not have been able to go out to French Guiana and do that trip. There was flights to Paris, there was yellow fever vaccinations, all that, and that was all the patron money helped towards those costs, and that is why we absolutely love you. And of course, that's why I'm very, very keen to give the best space report I possibly can on that particular trip, because that was paid for by our patrons, and I love you.
Absolutely. You guys made that happen. You continue to make the show happen. So thank you ever so much. Tell a friend. Tell your mum.
Leave a review on iTunes.
You know what? We will support you back We promise.
Absolutely. So, Jamie, and everyone else,
That's it.
You have been listening to the Interplanetary podcast, putting the A's back into space.
Come on, England.
Bye-bye, space podcasts.
Meat, pie, sausage roll. Come on, England, score a goal.
Bye.
See you.